Okay, so this is the information session for campus action planning, specifically for the innovation cohort. I'm Alexis Bucknam, and I am the project director for campus action planning. As I mentioned, some of you know me, so you know I've been around Compact for a number of years and the community engagement space. Um, Most recently, I worked at Weber State University here in Utah. Let me get my. Okay, so I think it's important to ground us with the Campus Compact mission because that really informs a lot of what we're doing with CAP. So the Campus Compact supports, engages, and challenges higher education to realize its public purpose, and CAP has the same mission. So just to ground us in what the Campus Action Planning for Civic and Community Engagement initiative and project is, it's a national initiative to integrate community engagement across institutional functions. It's intended to move engagement from a peripheral activity to a core pillar of institutional identity. And it's intended to ground higher education as a responsive and transformative agent of change in our democracy. I know a number of you probably have community or completed or considered completing the Carnegie Elective Community Engagement classification. So I thought I would just take a moment to help explain the difference between this CAP and Carnegie. So first of all, as many of you know, the Carnegie application or reapplication is a self-study. And so the idea there is to assess what you have accomplished between the times that the application is made available. What's different about CAP is that we could see that self-assessment. So if you've done a Carnegie application in the last couple of years, you could certainly use that as part of your self-assessment phase of the CAP. But really, CAP is intended to focus on action, implementation, and impact. So it really is sort of the next phase after that. Or conversely, if you're an institution that would like to seek Carnegie, this activity can help you build the infrastructure and the supports that you need in order to achieve the benchmarks that Carnegie has set out. The other thing that's really important to us in terms of CAP is that it is driven by institutional context and campus community priorities. So we don't want this to be prescriptive in the sense that you have to do one thing collectively as you're doing CAP, and that also it has an iterative approach. Even in strategic planning, we're starting to see more often than not that campuses are moving into more of strategic frameworks and thinking about a 2 to 3 year frame rather than 5 or more. So that is something that we're very interested in supporting campuses to think about as it relates to civic and community engagement. We also recognize that the reasons or the motivations that might drive participating in campus action planning will differ and vary depending on your institution, your context, your institutional type, etc. So as I mentioned, many campuses are engaging in different sorts of strategic planning, whether that's that sort of shorter term framework like I mentioned, or the more traditional. We've seen a lot of churn in higher education since COVID, and so a lot of our campuses are experiencing new leadership in various ways. In some cases, we may have had something that has happened between campus and community, or some sort of a crisis that is driving the need for deeper and more thoughtful engagement. Many of us have experienced budget cuts or other forms of financial constraint, whether that's unfilled positions or other aspects of those cuts. In many cases, our states or the federal government have signaled that they value things differently, and so we're having to adjust our priorities and align accordingly. In addition, if we have new leadership on campus, their priorities may be different, and we're having to align with that. And in many cases, campuses completed a campus action plan in 2016. It was actually called Civic Action Planning back then. And that was for the 30th anniversary of Campus Compact. And so we have had campuses mention to us that they see this as a great opportunity to follow up on what they did 10 years ago, and to hopefully grow what they had developed over the course of that experience. Um, Before I move on to the next slide, I will pause here and see, and again, this is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, you can ask your question at the end, but I just want to make sure if there were any questions related to those first few slides before I move on more to the framework that we plan, that we're using broadly for CAP, and a little more detail about that. And so just so you all know, I'm not able to look in the chat. So if you've put questions in the chat, just know that I will ask you to voice them out at the end of the meeting if we don't have any questions now. Okay, seeing no questions, I will move on. So we have 3 guiding principles currently for CAP. This is also being revisited, so this may change a little bit before we release the final framework later this month. But just as a frame of reference, our guiding principles for CAP are adaptable and agile planning process. So as I mentioned, this isn't a one-size-fits-all. We very much want it to be relevant, that you can focus on your institutional values, culture, and context. And also those in the community in which you plan to connect your work or already are connecting your work clearly. And then certainly not least is that the community campus engagement that we are all committing to is oriented toward justice and change, as I mentioned before. Then we think about the imperatives that really inform how we go about the campus action planning process. Interrogation, this can look a lot of different ways, right? You want to interrogate what you are doing. You want to interrogate the quality of the engagement that you're doing. We want to think about being asset based. You know, a lot of times, especially now, it can be really difficult not to get stuck in problem solving. And that can be an important part of this, but we also want you to focus on the assets, not only that you have on your campus that exist in the community, and build on those as part of this effort. In terms of innovation, it could be true that it's something brand new, or it could be that you're doing things differently, and that is the innovation, and we really encourage that. That it's future focused. Obviously, we have to pay close attention to the history and potential harms that we may have inflicted on our community, uh, and think about how, as we look towards the future, we are grounded in that. We're thinking about repairing and healing that harm, but also making substantive change in our community. That it's systemic. So obviously systemic can mean a lot of different things. You know, obviously in higher education, for example, we probably aren't looking for folks to pick one college if they're at a large research university and to focus just on that. We want it to span the institution. We also, as you'll see in a moment, I'll talk a little bit about the domains that are part of this framework. And so the other way I like to think about systemic is, even if you're focusing on 1 or 2 domains, being really planful about what are the intended and unintended consequences of those changes in those domains that might affect other parts of the system, right? So that's another way to think about systemic. And then last is transformative, which obviously we would like all of the work that we do to move towards transformation and away from transaction. So these are the phases of action planning that were developed by Gary Kirk and Yetunde Omede, who are listed here at the bottom of the slide. They were our research fellows for CAP last year. And so as you can see here, they developed a couple of different ways to think about campus action planning, an abbreviated timeline and a traditional timeline. What I will say is, given the timeline that we have for the innovation cohort, we will be leaning more towards the abbreviated timeline in terms of thinking about how much time you might spend on each of these different phases of the planning process. I would say right now, excuse me, is pre-planning. What you're doing to hopefully prepare your application and all of that. And there will be a little bit more of that once if you're selected into the cohort, you'll be provided with some additional um, resources to do that. And then you move on, we'll move through these different phases of self-assessment, as I previously mentioned. Other things that you can use for that would be accreditation, uh, self-studies or program reviews. And also, we encourage you to be really thoughtful about gathering data from your community as part of this, as you're thinking about the engagement. From there, you'll move on to aspirational planning. If you're familiar with human-centered design, that would be more the ideation. And then you'd be funneling back into scoping and operationalizing, identify the specific things that your campus community team will be focusing on for planning, and then ultimately implementation, monitoring, and adoption. So these are the different phases. And what we anticipate is through the innovation cohort, we will be providing scaffolded support through all of these different pieces. And even if you're not selected into the innovation cohort, our goal is to be able to provide you with support to do these different phases. So I will share a little bit more about that towards the end. So these are the planning domains. If you're familiar with what is affectionately referred to as the FERCO rubric for institutions, this follows that pretty closely. So if you've seen that before, this is probably familiar. We start with institutional identity. We move to faculty and staff engagement. And again, this is obviously not progressive. It's just you have to label things: student engagement and support, community partnerships and collaboration, and then institutional infrastructure support and coordination. And so, as I mentioned before, it could be true that you decide to focus on a couple of these domains for your CAP, but we want you to systemically think about all of them as you're moving through the process. So I will pause there again because I know that I've covered a lot of information just to see if there are any questions. And again, I will take questions at the end. And if you have a question, feel free to come off mute or raise your hand with the Zoom function.
Hi there. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Alicia.
Hi, how are you? My question is, and I just want to make sure I heard you right, that if we were just to pick, for example, I said I would like to, if I wanted to focus on the community partnerships and collaboration domain, you're saying that we can just pick pieces of this for the overall report and really put a heavy emphasis on one of these domains?
Yeah, I would say one, two, whatever is appropriate for your context, but especially with the innovation cohort, because that is going to be the more abbreviated timeline, we recognize that you probably won't be able to focus on all five.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So now I'm going to provide you with some specific details about the innovation cohort. So I want to make sure you receive all these details. So as you may know, if you've seen the application, that it's going to be a rigorous engagement arc running from June through December of 2026 for the convenings. And the action plan itself will be submitted in January. So I'll cover that in a moment. Each selected campus will receive a $3,000 mini grant. Um, I should say at this point that this initiative is being supported by the Henry Luce Foundation based in New York. And so we're grateful to them to provide us with the resources to be able to provide all these supports that we couldn't the last time we did CAP. So a mini grant, just to remind you all, the cohort is limited to 20 selected institutions. We do provide a preference for campus compact member institutions. So keep that in mind. As innovation cohort members, you'll obviously have access to the CAP fellows, which we will be posting to the website soon, and coaches, which we are in the process of recruiting currently. Um, and maybe just to give you a little bit of context, the fellows will be primarily responsible for supporting the cohort and developing the arc of the engagement. They will be available for some coaching, but coaches will be um, individuals who have experience doing this kind of work that will be available for one-on-one or small group conversations. Um, Innovation cohort participants will have early access to resources. We will host 5 virtual convenings, which will include both an orientation and a closing session. And then we will have one in-person CAP Institute, where we will expect 2 members of your team to attend. Um, and I think it's okay for me to say, Elizabeth, that we will be hosting the CAP Institute for the Innovation Cohort at Metropolitan State University of Denver. And we're really excited about that. So more details will be coming. And then obviously we expect all of the participants in the cohort to submit a campus action plan. Uh, just to remind us, next Monday is the priority deadline. As I mentioned previously, Campus Compact members receive priority. Um, we really don't have any sense of how many applications we're going to receive. So it doesn't hurt if you're not a Campus Compact member to submit by the deadline. But just know that that will be one of the things we take into consideration. And then if we haven't filled the cohort by the end with that initial priority deadline, we will continue. So I know one of the requirements is that you need to have a letter from a cabinet level leader on your campus. Part of that is to make sure that you will be supported by your institution to do this work, so that the resources that are being committed to your institution, we know will be leveraged. And so we'll accept those rolling, but obviously the sooner you can get those in, the better. As I mentioned, we'll have a virtual orientation. We have 2 dates for that. The first one is June 16th. We hope that most participants can participate. Participants in the cohort can join us on June 16th, but we will have a follow-up on July 14th. For those institutions that participate on June 16th, we will work with you to make sure you have some sort of a coaching call between that convening on the 16th and the Innovation Cohort Institute in August. Currently, that is set for the 12th and 13th there is a small chance it could be moved to the 11th and 12th, but we hope to confirm that within the next week. I mentioned that we will have convenings. So after the Institute in August, these will be the convenings in September, October, and November. We'll have a closing session in December, as I mentioned. What I will say, because this is a question that's come to me through email, so I might as well address it. Um, we recognize that if you've got teams of 6 to 10 people, the reality is it's going to be difficult for all of your team members to participate in all of these virtual convenings. And obviously, not everyone will be able to join the in-person institute. So what I will say is we would have the expectation, obviously imperfectly, that as much as possible, the same 2 people minimum are showing up to all of these convenings so that they're getting the full picture of what's being shared and can support the team through the process. Uh, we may want to have other team members join the closing session, but that is something that the fellows will be determining over the course of the next month or so. And then, as I mentioned, the final CAP submission deadline is January 15th of 2027. So we recognize that that's around the holidays, so we want to give people as much notice as possible as we're um, sharing what to expect. So just very quickly, I'll share if you haven't yet. I know I have gone into the application and I think I've seen a couple of your campuses have started applications, so thank you for that. But I will very quickly share what is the application will ask you. So there's a campus profile section. The nice thing is that we have a lot of information about your campus, so we'll just ask you for your state and your campus, and that'll populate a lot of that. And then we'll ask who's completing the application. Then we'll move on to readiness and strategic alignment. So we'll ask you to provide us with what you anticipate your strategic motivation is for pursuing campus action planning. What we also know is through the course of this, that may change, and that's okay, and that's a good thing. So, but we want to get a sense. We'll also ask you about your anticipated support needs. So those phases that I shared earlier, self-assessment, aspirational planning, etc. We'll ask you to share with us where you anticipate you'll need the most support and why. And then we'll also ask you about institutional capacity. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we're investing resources both in terms of financially with the mini grant, but also obviously all the fellows and coaches and staff time. So we want to get a sense from you of what your institution is committing in terms, doesn't have to be cash, but time, time release, etc., to your team to make sure you're successful. And then we'll finally ask you about your team composition. So we anticipate teams to be between 6 and 10 members. We have 2 spots for a team lead chair. You only need to complete one of those. We do have the expectation that there is a campus leader, which we define as dean at the dean level or above, on your CAP team. And we want you to have at least one community partner. Although we would encourage you to have more than one if you are able and have folks that are interested and have the capacity. A couple of folks have asked about including students. We encourage that. We know that because some of this is happening over the summer, that can be a little bit complicated. But if you want to add students a little bit later in the process, or you're able to include students from the beginning, we would love to have students as part of this as well. Again, that's 6 to 10, 6 being the minimum. And then basically we need a letter of support from a cabinet level leader on your campus, signaling that they support this, that you will, again, this might speak a little bit to that institutional capacity. And then we will just ask whoever's filling that out to confirm that 2 members of your campus community team can attend that in-person institute in August. And that is the application. So it's not too onerous, I hope, and can provide us with enough information that we can review those quickly and hopefully start making selections next week. So just to remind us, the priority deadline is next Monday. You will note on the calendar that it's 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. And we do that obviously to provide campuses extra time to get that in if they're trying to do it by the deadline. As I mentioned, the Institute, I haven't updated this, but it is going to be in Denver. Um, as I said, it may be the 12th and 13th or the 11th and 12th, and we should confirm that this week, within the next week, I should say. And then just to remind everyone, the submission deadline is January 15th, and similarly, that's Pacific time. So I am going to stop the recording